This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. This is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning podcast, and I am here today with Philippe Lemoine, a Frenchman and a fellow at the CSPI, and also a PhD candidate in philosophy, I believe philosophy of science at Cornell. Is that all correct, Philippe?
Yep.
All right. So I think the first thing that I want to talk about is an interesting dispute that we've had, not a dispute, a discussion. Like we were hanging out in Washington, D.C. recently, and, you want to make your life in France, which that's fine. And, you basically said that you prefer France. And as an American, I always find that, I'm liberal enough to accept that is an opinion that should be allowed. But it's a little inexplicable to me. And I'm going to, let me just outline my reasoning to listeners out there, because about half of you guys are not American. I know. So my defense of America, aside from the fact that it's rich and powerful, is also it's a massive country. So I've lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. I've lived in the Central Valley. I lived in Eastern Oregon. I lived in Western Oregon. I lived in Portland. I've lived in Seattle. I lived in Austin. I've lived in upstate New York. I've lived in Western Pennsylvania. I've been all across the country. There is no one America in a way. There's a lot of Americas, and you have a lot of choice. And so when someone like you, Philippe, or someone says, I prefer living in Japan. Okay. Okay. With Japan, I think I can see why you would say that, insofar as the orderliness, the homogeneity, and the predictability of Japan. It's extremely hard to match that anywhere in the United States. Okay. With France, I'm sure there are things too, and maybe we'll explore what that is. So America covers a lot of the distribution. I mean, if you want kind of like voluble, outgoing people, go to, Southern Florida, if you want kind of like loud, big personalities, go to LA. If you want more low key people, you can go to Minnesota. Pacific Northwest, where I'm from, is pretty low key. And so there's a lot of variation. There's a lot of things you can select in this country. So I think maybe I just value choice a lot. People have choices to do a lot of things in this country and be a lot of things. And so in terms of individual self-actualization, I just have a hard time seeing where I would rather be. I have considered it over the last decade or so, especially the last 5 years. There are currents in American culture that, both Philippe and I are actually pretty opposed to, and that, non-English speaking countries in particular have been more resistant to. So I see that point. But, let's start out something simple, because you do start this controversy that got into the mainstream press from X to the mainstream press, and that's about food. American food versus French food. I mean, I don't really want to get into this, because there's some parts of American food where I'm like, I get what you're saying. But again, this is the issue with what American food is, because I live in Austin, Texas. And in Austin, Texas, American food is Tex-Mex, which is very different than, say, food in Minnesota or New England. And I'm also from the Pacific Northwest, and there we have, salmon and other things like that. So, in California cuisine, although that's kind of created by Alice Waters and The Last Generation. My point there is, what do you mean by American food? By French food, I think I know what you mean. It's the type of cuisine that was perfected in the 16th century, 17th century, and then really more recently with the Michelin stars and stuff like that, with a certain philosophy. But talk about the food thing, and also I guess you could give people who are somehow listening to a podcast but not entirely online the context of French food is better and American food is crap.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, first of all, I just want to note that I never talked about American food. I talked about food in America, in the US. It's not quite the same thing, because American food, I mean, as you say, like, I mean, it's to the extent that there exists such a thing, there is not just one thing, even like the local cuisine, like varies like a lot depending on the region. I mean, this is true in France too. French cuisine is very different depending on the region, but I feel like it's even less coherent in the US. But mostly, the food that Americans eat, is not a lot of it is not American in any clear sense. But so mostly, well, it's funny because I made this tweet, so to give people the context. I was actually pretty drunk at this point. Made this tweet saying that I don't even remember exactly what the first tweet was. It was something to the effect that like spending hours at the table, like really enjoying the food in France, and that's like people cannot outside of France cannot really or maybe people in the US. I don't remember exactly what I said again. Cannot really understand this. And then I saw a number of Americans who were like, commenting that no, this is nonsense or something to the effect that, of course, the food is better in the US. And to me, this was just absurd. So I made another tweet, which is the one that blew up, where I was saying something like, again, I don't remember the exact words, but I was something like, it's amazing. Americans really believe they have better food. So again, I wasn't talking about American food. Americans really believe they have better food than France, that they really believe it, which I thought was amazing. And so this kind of like really blew up, like it had like 18 million impression. Like the funny thing is that, like I said, I was pretty drunk at this point. So, I was at a party with friends. I just shut down the phone, and then I woke up the next morning only to realize that like thousands and thousands of really angry people had reacted to it and like were really, really upset by it. So anyway, it's funny because if you read what those people were saying when they were not like, when they're making like coherent responses, because very often it was barely coherent, but it was something to the effect that restaurants in the US are far better than in France. Well, actually, I don't even believe that is true, but I agree that, the US is a pretty good like restaurant scene. I still think that for the same price on average, you'll get better in France. It's probably true that you'll get less variety. So if you value variety enough, then sure, it's a point in favor of the US here. Some people have said that, if you go to the very, very best restaurants, you'll get better food in the US than in France. I don't believe that is true either. But whatever, it doesn't really matter because when I was talking about food in France, the mere fact that people, like almost all of the people talked about restaurants was kind of proving my point to my mind because, food in France and food in most of the world really is not specifically about restaurants or mainly about restaurants really. And so the fact I found it very revealing that people would, when you talk about food, people automatically go to restaurants and talk about that. Because this is not what people in France think about when they think about food. I was, as I was saying before, I was at a party, we were eating food that we had made, it wasn't like we weren't at a restaurant or something. And that's what I had in mind when I made that tweet. And so I thought that was really revealing, and what it was really revealing of is the fact that the food culture in France and in the US is very different. Like there's a sense in which in France in particular, I think this is true more generally, but I think it's particularly true in France. Food, I say more generally outside of the US is what I mean. Food is like, it's not just, it's not just a way of sustaining yourself. It's also like an important social experience. It's a very social thing. And so we do this where we get at the table and we stay at 4 hours at the table, which I feel is like much less common in the US. And so, this is the kind of
okay, yeah, I gotta jump in here. It's like, I mean, 4 hours at a table. That's a lot of time. So I mean, that's I'm wondering what people are going to say in the comments. I'm actually like not able to. I'm like trying to comprehend 4 hours at the table. Yeah, but you're done with the food. You're just hanging around the table talking then.
Honestly, it depends. I mean, it can definitely be 4 hours without. Obviously, you talk. You don't just eat, but
Okay, so we recently had
it's not
dinner in
unusual.
DC.
It's not unusual. Yeah, 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 yeah.
We had dinner in DC. I don't think we made it to 4 hours. I think it was like 3.5.
Yeah, it was close though. It was close. Like I said, it was actually something
That
major.
was very
And
exceptional in my experience.
yeah,
But in
so
your experience, it's not
this is not
exceptional.
when you're meeting with friends in France, it's totally not exceptional at all. So, but in my experience in the US, it is. And so I've rarely done that in the US. And in France, I do that pretty much every time I have a dinner with my friends. Like not in restaurants. When we go out in restaurants, actually it does last a long time, much longer than Americans spend in restaurants too, but not nearly as much as when you do that at somebody's home. So that's one thing. Another thing I had in mind is that look, people just eat better at home. Like so when Americans are not uh, eating outside, eating out. They just, I mean, it's honestly just absolutely baffling to me that anyone would deny that. Anyone who has experienced both, like the idea that French people don't eat better on average than Americans is just completely absurd. Like, I cannot even comprehend that someone would think that if they've experienced both. So,
Wait, so
it's just
do you
like,
live, Philippe? Wait, Philippe, do you live alone?
yeah, leave alone
Do you
in
live with?
Paris. Yeah.
Okay, so in France, you live alone, and so you're a single. I mean, you're well, not you're well, whatever. You're male living alone, and you cook, and I mean, so it's kind of a joke in the United States. There's a lot of jokes about the way men living alone, especially in their 20s and 30s, cook. Like they just heat things up, or like I'll like
Yeah.
I have a cast iron pan. I make steaks. Like
Yeah. Yeah. I
fry
mean,
up some shrimp.
to be honest, I don't even necessarily speak for myself because I don't cook all that much. Although I do cook, I think I probably cook a lot more than, which is not saying a lot, than the typical American single man. But like people, if you go to a French family, people just cook all the time, and what they eat is just so much better, both in terms of how healthy it is and in terms of taste than what the typical American family will eat. I mean, I'm not saying that Americans are like literally incapable of cooking good stuff. I've had good homemade meals, in the US. That's not the point. I'm just making a point about what's true on average, and I think this is definitely true. So it's Nate Silver wrote a good post, which I mostly agreed with the caveats I made, or some of the caveats that I made earlier, about this controversy, where, and I think the main thing is that, yeah, if you're talking about restaurants, and the US does have something over France if you value diversity enough, which, it's not that I don't value it at all, but I guess I value it less than other people. So, but if you do, then yeah, sure, you will have, like, on average, you'll have more diversity in restaurants in the US. But like I said, restaurants are just like a small subset of what I was talking about, not even really what I was talking about at all. And so I thought it was revealing, and it shows something about the culture, like, so people, when you're eating with colleagues, during the week, during you're working and you have lunch with your colleagues, it often like lasts 2 hours too. People go out, or they're together much more than in the US, as far as I can tell. Again, based on my here, I was gonna say it's purely anecdotal. It's not purely anecdotal because you have like surveys on time use that show that too. Although I think those surveys, they need to be taken with a grain of salt. Um, but I have no doubt based on this and anecdotal evidence that this is true on the whole. So it's something, and there's just one example to go back to the broader debate. What you were asking at the very beginning about why you found that baffling that anyone who has presumably the choice would prefer to live in France rather than the US, is that's just one example of something about French culture that I just prefer. Look, I'm not even saying, I mean, I do think it, but, if, I was going to say, I'm not even saying that this is like objectively better, although, I really strongly do feel it's better, but whatever, like I'm not a Taliban, if people prefer a different way of like experiencing food, that's fine with me. Like I'm not forcing anyone to like the things I like. And so I'm just saying, as far as I'm concerned personally, I prefer this way of approaching food, of experiencing food, than the American way. So that's just one example. And, and I guess like this is just like, it's very, again, like going back to the broader debate, it's very difficult to say exactly, what I prefer about France, because I think it's probably like an accumulation of small things. Most of them probably just born out of habit, just because I was born there and raised there. Uh, but that make me prefer it. And look, I think often, uh, if you're asked why you prefer your country to another, I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing to just say because it's my country. And that's kind of how I feel, like it does, produce a number of habits, that it shapes your preferences in a number of ways. And so it's not surprising that I think typically people prefer to live in their country. That's not to say, that because people, look, I'm critical of various things about the US, like especially stuff like US foreign policy, and like I make fun of their food, etc. So people sometimes think I hate the US, but I don't hate the US at all. I think the US is great. I have many friends in the US. I go there often. I think, Americans have many fine qualities. So if I'll give you an example of something that the Americans are definitely better than the French, in my opinion, is like they have a much better sense of hospitality, for instance. That's something I was really shocked by when I arrived in the US. I lived there for several years. And I was really amazed by their sense of hospitality. Like I remember like moving into my apartment, like running into the old guy who was living next door. And I literally never met that guy. It was just like, oh, if you ever need a ride to Walmart, you should just let me know. I'll give you a ride to Walmart. I literally never met that person. So I thought that was great. So, they definitely have many qualities over the French. I'm not even saying, that the France is superior in every respect. But like I said, probably largely as a result of the fact that I was born and raised there, it shaped my preferences in such a way that overall I prefer life in France, and like I said, it's difficult to say. I couldn't tell you, like, I couldn't give you one thing in particular or even like two or three that I prefer. It's probably like an accumulation of small things that maybe taken individually, they don't amount to much, but it just adds up. And overall, in the end, I just prefer to be there. And I think, I don't think it's weird. I think most people, even if you had like open borders, like, and even if you're just talking, because of course, if you have open borders, people who live like in really poor countries, yeah, sure, they will go to the US or another like rich country, but just because at some point the difference in material standard of living just overcome the other stuff. That's normal. But if we're just looking at like rich countries, so of course, like Europe is not as rich as the US, but nevertheless, we've reached a point where it's still like similarly developed country. If you had open borders, you wouldn't have like France and Italy and Spain would not empty because everyone would go to the US. That's just not the case. So that's just, and the reason is because most French people, most Spaniards, most Italians just prefer to be in France.
They already had the chance. I mean, there was already when the U.S. was way richer than Europe.
Oh,
actually,
yeah.
And like, so the people that stayed, there's going to be some, selection there. I mean, we don't just speculate what it is, but I mean, like something like a third of Norway came to the United States, and 2/3 did not, right? And actually, the 2/3,
yeah. There's actually I remember reading a paper about this that showed that there was like actually a lot of that. It was very selective in the sense that people self-selected into immigration when they had certain qualities that the others didn't. So, whatever the reasons, my point is, again, even if you did that today, and especially if you did that today, was at the time Norway was extremely poor, not like today, right? But if you even more so, if you did that today, if there was like open borders between Europe, Western Europe, and the US, note that they're like very similar in terms of the material standard of living. Like you would have of course you would have more immigration than you have today toward, in the direction of the US. You would also have more in the opposite direction because some Americans like the European way of life or the various European ways of life. But mostly it wouldn't be like, we wouldn't have like really shocking levels of immigration. Like it wouldn't be like massively socially disruptive in any way. It would be still fairly limited. Again, it's very, very different than if you did that with like poor countries, because then the difference in standard of living is large enough that, yeah, you're going to get like much larger immigration flow. But so, just to say, I just say that to say that because you were surprised by this, but when you think about this, when you see it this way, it's not really that surprising, right? It's what most people would do. I'm not in that respect. I'm just like most people in France, I think, and most people in most countries, really, the most rich countries.
Yeah, so I mean, let's talk about the economics a little bit because that's easier to talk about. So like last I checked, like with one of the PPP per capita GDP, actually, like I'm just gonna check right now. Calculators for France, I got like 45,000 USD, and for the US, I got 65,000. So living in France, you're like, considerably poorer. But what you're trying to say, or not what you're trying to say, what you're saying is, yeah, let me just check. So this is one of the current international PPP. Okay, this is 63,000 for the US. It's about like 46,000 UK and like 45,000 France, whatever. I mean, that order of magnitude, right? And so for you, I mean, you would make more money in the US if you immigrated, right? But that money is not worth the transition in lifestyle and the cultural differences and everything like that. There's non-economic factors at play here. It's not just arbitrary.
Yeah. No, so I mean, money, I'm not saying it's not important and that it doesn't contribute to my well-being. It obviously does, but it does have like fairly rapidly decreasing marginal returns. Of course, it's going to depend on people. Some people are more able, who can enjoy like a higher revenue more for longer as they climb up the ladder of income. But as far as I'm concerned, again, I'm not here like pretending that money doesn't matter. I know that it does, and that it doesn't contribute to my well-being. That having more money would not make me better off in some ways. For sure, this would be the case. But yeah, there is a trade-off, and I feel like the added revenue, the added income I would get, the increased material standard of living I could get by living in the US is just not worth the loss of the other stuff. And the other stuff is more immaterial. It's harder to describe, but it's just there, there are also things like even more prosaic than like, my parents are getting old and they're in France. So, I don't want to be like, I want to be able to see them often. Like when I have kids, I want them to see their grandparents just like more than once a year, that sort of things. But even like beyond this, yeah, again, like there is to give you an example, like, so I go to DC regularly now, and every single time I've been to DC, I've heard like guns being shot next to where I live, where I'm staying. And so this is not, I mean, this is just weird, like it's not that bad, like, I mean, it's not as if someone had shot me or anything, but this is an example of something that is unpleasant and that it's an experience you wouldn't have in France, in a French city. Like, this is just nuts to me. That's especially where I'm staying, which is like not, I'm not staying in a ghetto part of Washington, D.C. And it's just insane to me that someone would like shoot a gun, sometimes in broad daylight in like the capital of I just, coming from France, it's an extremely weird thing and not one that I particularly envy. I mean, there are other things like I don't like about American cities. So, for instance, because population density is so low, they're really sprawling compared to European cities. And so you can't really walk anywhere. The public transportation is almost always shit, except like with a handful of exceptions. So actually, DC it's not that bad, but it's still not Paris. And so you have to drive everywhere, take a Uber, like which I find a pain. I like to walk too. So one thing I like about Paris, I can walk to like a lot of places, or at least do part of the trip when I'm moving within Paris, walking, which I enjoy. Uh, in the US, it's much less the case in American cities because there's you mentioned LA during your introduction. Honestly, I do not understand LA, for instance. Like the fact that some people like living in that city is something that I really do not understand. Like it's just the city is an abomination to me. But anyway, and then largely, not just, but largely because it's so sprawling, and I do not understand how people can enjoy this. But so that's
Wait, what do you think
like
about Boston?
I've never been to Boston, so I've heard that it had a more European feel, so that I might enjoy
Yeah.
it. But I've never been there, so I can't tell you.
Well,
But I've
yeah.
heard that several
What
times.
I would say about what I would say about Boston, is it's not as big of a city, and it's an older city and it developed more organically, and so for example, the northern part of Boston, like Little Italy and stuff like that, they have they have like streets that are okay. Like this is like feeling like Europe, in America, most cities have a pretty straightforward grid pattern. You know, Boston has part of the city that's not like that because it's old. And it's a substantial. I mean, it's a non-trivial part of the city. Anyway, I just want to bring that up because a lot of your points are taken. But again, one thing that I want to make clear to people in other parts of the world is we are a very big, diverse country, and there are parts of the country that are quite different than other parts of the country, and so this whole crime issue that's a legit thing. We do have high rates of crime, and we don't need to get into why. I mean, some of it's political and self-inflicted, as you know. But if crime is really your concern, you can go live in Vermont, New Hampshire. Now, on the other hand, what you're saying is like you want a big, safe urban area, and that's difficult. You got to go to the suburbs. You got to go to rural areas. Although a city like New York is
That's
pretty safe. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean that's not even what I'm saying because personally, if I could get away with it, I would rather live in the middle of nowhere because I'm not really a big city person. I mean, there are things I enjoy about cities, but so like recently, like last time I was in the US recently, I went to a wedding in North Carolina in the Appalachian part of the state, kind of like in the middle of nowhere, and I loved it. I think this is like this like if I had to live in the US and I could choose, I didn't have like any obligation that kept me from living there, I would 100% live there rather than, in a big city. I think it's great. And I also like the rednecks, like I guess most people. I mean, that is most people in like blue America, but I just like them. And so, yeah, no, that's so again, there are lots. One thing I do want to say about the diversity stuff, though, is that so obviously the US is vastly larger than France, say, although France by European standards is actually pretty huge. Um, but I think Americans underestimate how diverse European countries are. I mean, talking about France, like both in terms of like food, architecture, people's character, the traditions, anything you can think of. Like different regions of France are vastly different. Like you go to Strasbourg in the northeast and you go to Marseille or in Provence, the southeast, it's like completely different. I grew up in Bordeaux, it's very different from say Bretagne, or Normandy or like so it's people like, I feel like Americans, really underestimate this. I'm not saying that there isn't a sense in which the US is even more diverse. I'm not denying this. But I think the gap is much smaller than Americans realize. And so that's another thing is that, yeah, sure. I mean, I will say, if we're talking about political diversity of political system, for instance, yeah, I mean, I do think that, for instance, one of the really nice things about the US is the fact that it's a federal system. And so you really can like, I mean, of course, you do have federal laws and states are constrained by the Constitution and etc. But nevertheless, it's certainly true that it gives a lot more room to experiment and test different things. And I think that's a great thing about the US. So that's another thing. Again, people think I hate the US. I don't hate the US. I think here's an example of something that I think is really great and that we definitely don't have in France. So yeah, that's, again, it's, nothing against the US or Americans. It's just, I think like a pretty natural preference that, when I say natural, I don't mean that every French people is like me. There are some French people who prefer to live in the US. I mean, French people who have the experience, so they're in a position to know. Sure. I mean, so good for them. I have no issue with that. That's just not me.
Yeah. So actually, to your point, I think I do want to support that insofar as I give like a couple of examples. Americans have an idea of Italy and Italian cuisine, but as you know, there is no such thing insofar as, there's cuisine in Genova, there's, Genovese, there's cuisine in the South, there's Sicilian food, and then they're in Campania and Naples. Obviously, in Milan, you have this whole like different type of, polenta and kind of like a thicker, heartier cuisine. And so, this is an ancient country. Italy's an ancient country. There's a lot of regionalism. There is a lot of internal diversity. What we think of Italian American is, I mean, I double checked. This number does look like it is true. It seems high, but it seems 80 to 90% of Italian Americans are actually Sicilian. Most of the rest are Southern Italian from like either Naples or Calabria or Puglia. And then there's a small minority that are from the north of Italy.
Yeah, I mean, it was the poor Italians who came, so.
Yeah, but it was also like depending on what time. So for whatever reason, Argentina got the northern Italians. So, which is weird. This is going to surprise people because, the way Argentina.
I would have assumed they were also Southerners, but.
Yeah, the ratio is not as skewed, but the early waves were overwhelmingly Northern Italian, and then the Southerners came later. But it's still predominant. It's still more than 50 Northern Italian. So the Argentine Italian accent is because Italian in America, the Italians that came to America mostly didn't speak Italian. They mostly spoke Sicilian because Italian's based on the Florence dialect, right? So that in contrast, in Argentina, they spoke much closer to the standard Italian because they're from the north, and outside of Veneto, most of the northern dialects are kind of more similar. And Spanish in Argentina has a Italian accent. Another thing I have to say is I was in Europe in 2010 for I think it was 2 months, and so we spent time in Italy, in northern Italy mostly, and then Finland. And one thing I'll say is like going from Italy to Finland was like going from Italy to the United States, just culturally and how everything felt. So obviously, like the Finnish language is not English, and Finnish people don't look a little different. They're not as diverse, quote unquote, as Americans, but they're driving SUVs. It's big country, low density. And in terms of their food, I don't know. It wasn't America, but it felt so much more like America than Northern Italy that it was shocking to me because, when I was in Italy, I knew that I was in a different country. In Finland, I would go out on the street and sometimes I would get confused. I would be like, oh, well, maybe this is. I was mostly in Tampere, which is like a medium-sized city, like in the South Center. So I think that that's an interesting thing to note. Like within European countries, there's a lot of diversity. And then obviously in the EU itself, there's a lot of diversity, which is one reason that labor mobility isn't as great as we have in the US,
Yeah.
I mean, everyone in Portugal should go live in Germany and work there,
Just the language barrier is huge because, so maybe people don't know that, but like within the EU, you can go and live and work anywhere, without there's no. It's basically an open border state within the EU. So it kind of like illustrates the point. You still have vastly different income levels, in different European countries. And yet the amount of immigration is fairly limited, much more than it would be if people only decided where to go based on monetary considerations. And that's related to what I mean. Of course, like I said, there's a language barrier. So just the fact that you literally, but that's not the only reason, because you can learn a new language. People do it, people do it all the time. But yeah, I mean, people have those preferences that I was talking about. They tend to prefer to, it takes a lot. I'm not saying that no amount of money will do it, but as I was saying also before, as you grow richer, the amount, the delta grows that is necessary to make you move also increases, because as I was saying, the returns of money, are decreasing. The marginal returns of money are decreasing as you get richer. And so even a country like Portugal that is still much poorer than Germany, it has become a lot richer in recent decades. And so now there used to be quite a lot of Portuguese immigration, not to Germany, but to France. So we've had up until say actually probably going into the 90s, but mostly 80s, I'd say, we actually had a lot of Portuguese immigration in France. That was the last European wave of immigration to France, was Portuguese. But still, even back then, most of the Portuguese stayed home. And so, yeah, so that the EU point is an interesting thing, because it also means that what I was saying before, well, it's different countries, but I was saying about how you have, because it's a federal system, you have you can try different things. I mean, to some extent, it's also true in the EU, but in the EU, it's not quite the same, because it's you're going to another country. In the US, you're staying in the US, So if you're American, I'd say that's, most people would prefer this. Like they feel like if they don't have to actually leave their country, that's a point in, that makes it easier. And that, in the EU. So, but it is important. I do think that Americans vastly underestimate the amount of diversity in Europe, both Europe as a whole. Often you hear them talk about Europe as if it were like one big country, kind of like how they talk about Africa too. But no, it's not, it's very different. Like, European countries are extremely different in about every possible way you can think of, in terms of the socioeconomic system, the culture, language, tradition, the food, anything, it's very different. And then even within countries, you have a lot of differences. I mean, certainly true in a large country like France, but it's true even in smaller countries. It's definitely true in Spain. I mean, Spain is a pretty big country, but even in Portugal, even in Switzerland, which are much smaller, you have a lot of diversity. And I think that, again, Americans don't realize that. So yeah, that's, you still have, but again, I'm not, you still have if you value diversity, you will still have plenty of it, say, if you stay in France. Again, I say that as someone who,
Yeah.
I mean, actually, I do like French diversity. I do like the fact that I get very different food, and different people are just different and even look different. People in southern France look different from people in northern France. I mean, I can't say that this is something that I care that much about, but the different food and characters and stuff, yeah, this is enjoyable. But again, I don't value diversity per se all that much, and I wouldn't say that I'm just saying, this is, I think it's important to point that out, because I really, again, think that Americans underestimate, they really see those countries as monolithic in a way, and in a way they're not.
Well, I mean, so we're talking about diversity in France. You mentioned it. I want to pivot to, your, well, I don't know if they're politically incorrect in France anymore with the National Front and everything like that. But your ideas, not your ideas, your conclusions, your opinions about immigration. We've had this discussion before, I think years ago on one of my other podcasts. More recently, we've had this discussion face to face. You weren't mostly talking to me, but because as I alluded to, just the listener, just so they know, we hung out in DC. You were in DC, I was in DC, and we hung out. And you have some opinions. So just do you know off the top of your head what fraction of people in France are immigrants? What fraction of people are non-Europeans? Like these sorts of things, because officially France doesn't track race or ethnicity, but you said that that's actually just kind of a little bit fake.
Yeah, it's not quite true. So it would be complicated to explain, but basically what is true is that the state, so the state cannot classify people by a race and use that to make any kind of decision, at least in theory. Often they find ways, we have some kinds of affirmative action too that uses, like loopholes or, tricks, kind of similar to what they do in Texas, when the courts banned affirmative action in Texas, they did this thing where I think they'd give preferential treatment in public university admissions for the 10% best students in each high school. And, knowing that high schools are highly racially segregated, that was a way of of evading the court decision, the court decision. We have similar things, So, it's not quite true, but you don't have the French census, for instance, doesn't have a question about what race people identify with. And this is actually illegal. It's not just that it doesn't have it. It couldn't have it. But for research purposes, there's nothing illegal about it. You have some legal protections, some things, formalities you have to satisfy before you can do this. But, it's increasingly, the main obstacle is not legal. It's cultural. Until fairly recently, social scientists in France were extremely reluctant in taking that stuff into account. And now it's been changing. It's changing slowly, but it's changing. And it's as the country, because of immigration, is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse, it's inevitable, I think, that it will just continue to change. So to answer your question, if you're talking about immigrants, it's a little bit more than 10% right now in France. So I think it's close to 11%. It's not quite 11%, but it's closer to 11 than to 10, I think. So I think in the US it's something like 13.5% or something. So it's pretty close. I think that's another thing people would be surprised to hear maybe, but the share of the population that's foreign born in France is fairly similar to the share that's foreign born in the US.
Yeah, you're right. I checked right now.
If you're talking about the share of the population that's non-European, I mean that's harder to tell because, so for instance, we do have actually quite a lot of data on where people were born and where their parents were born, and there's just a new data set that was released. I haven't gotten my hands on it, but that even includes data on where people's grandparents were born. So you can go back 3 generations, and you also know their country of citizenship at birth. So with that, it's actually, in some ways, it's even better. It depends, whether it's better, it depends on what you want to do with it. But in some ways, it's actually better than having self-identified race or ethnic group or whatever, because there's a sense in which it's more objective. And so we do have data on that stuff, but non-European, it depends because you have a lot of mixing. So that's another thing people, I think, in the US would be surprised to hear is that the rates of interracial marriage in France absolutely dwarf what you see in the US. I say people would be surprised because Americans have this idea that, they're so much more tolerant compared to Europe and blah, blah, blah. And I'm not even saying that there aren't some ways in which this is true. But the thing is that, again, it's very simplistic to just say that without specifying what you're talking about, because if you look at when they say that, a thing that I've heard very often is people will say that, the US is much more tolerant, and what they'll do is cite surveys that ask questions that have been done in several countries, including France and the US, and that ask questions of the sort, okay, would you be willing to live next to someone of a different race, that sort of things. And you will see that in the US, people reply, yes, a lot more often than in countries like France. And so people infer from this that, the Americans are much more racially tolerant or whatever exactly that means than French people. But the thing is that, okay, if you look at this kind of survey, you you may want to conclude this, but I think if you look at something which I think is more objective, like the rate of interracial marriage, like I said, they're just those like are dwarfed, in France, like in the US by the rates in France. Like it's much more common for like non-whites in France marry with white, basically, much more often, much more commonly than in the US.
Well,
And
okay, so
so,
let me I'm gonna jump in because you've been talking a little bit. Like I'll say a couple of things.
sure.
These like which country is more racist and all these things. I mean, they're a little like weird because they're not like super precise and specific. Because like, what does that even mean, right? So I will tell
I
you,
agree.
and I will tell you, it depends on country to country that you go in Europe. I haven't gone to France, so I can't speak personally about France. I have been to Northern Europe. I've been to England. I've been to Italy. And I will tell you that if you are a non-white person, depending on the country, there is a just much more obvious racialized feeling. I'll put it that way. People don't mask it nearly as much. I've lived in the United States my whole life. I've been to the South. White Americans just like do not do that in ways that I've experienced in Italy and Germany in particular. When I was in Finland, I didn't really experience it. In Finland, it was almost like I was an exotic creature, So they were just kind of curious about me. There was no. In England, I will say, England felt weird because it felt much more multicultural than the United States, even though it's whiter, insofar as there was just even though the interracial marriage rates for, especially like, like Afro-Caribbean people and whites are very, very high in the UK. I think with the Muslims in particular, there's just an expectation that you're ghettoized. It was a weird feeling because they just assumed that those people are different and separate, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas in the United States, there's more attempt, I think, to mix. So England people were not like as racist as in Italy or Germany or Austria. I didn't perceive any difference from the U.S. Mostly, they just stared at me when I opened my mouth because I do not sound English, because they were not expecting me to sound like that. I'm just saying, like, there's these like subtle, like not subtle, but there's differences in how people express. And the reality is, I'm not even necessarily saying like Italians are more racist than white people in Mississippi. Okay, I'm just to give a concrete example. But white people in Mississippi know not to. They do not speak to you like they spoke to black people in the 1960s anymore,
Yeah.
But in Italy, people are just like, they're racist. Like, just like, they just express their racism. You know what I'm saying? Like they'll like tail you in stores. Like, they'll like refuse. Like, I've been refused service in Italy, like that's never happened in the United States. You know what I'm saying? They just like, they won't serve you,
Yeah.
So, I'm just like bringing this up because like, I think this is what people are really talking about.
I mean,
in terms of like, yeah.
That's why I was saying that it really depends. I said at the beginning, it really depends on what you're talking about, and that's the kind of thing. Because one thing I've heard that I do think is actually true is that it's true that in the U.S. people find it easier to see someone who's not white as American than in most of Europe. I would say. I think this is true. But then it's complicated. My point is that it really depends on what media you're looking at. Because again, I mentioned the race of interracial marriage with France. And this is true even in France. If I'm honest, I think that I don't think that, I think people caricature that stuff. I think most French people don't really have a problem seeing a non-white person being French, provided, that they behave culturally like French people, etc. But certainly I would say that it's whether it's purely social desirability bias, the difference, or whether it's like more profound, I don't really know. This is true. The difference also holds if you compare France to the US. But like I said, then if you look at the rates of interracial marriage, you get a different picture. If you look at segregation is also much higher in the US. Even I'm talking about immigrants. Even if you forget about the Black Americans, they're much more segregated in the US than in France. So, it's more complex is what I'm saying. It's like there is no...
Yeah.
It really depends on exactly what you're looking at.
Well, I will say, so I think you alluded to something here where, I mean, European cities are quite multiracial, but, obviously you go to like the rural south of France, or they're still pretty white, or they're still pretty, native. Let's put it that way, like ethnically native. So the UK, for example, sometimes I think like Europeans don't understand or don't, because like, they go to their cities and they go to our cities, but America is a much less white nation than any European country, right? So the UK is about 87% white. Okay. That would be the whitest state in the country. That would be like New Hampshire. That's the whole country. And so in France, I mean, whatever, I think you're a little, depending on how you count the North Africans and whatnot. And like there is more, I'm surprised at how many French celebrities have like a North African grandparent. So that's hard to count. Like you'd actually have to do a genetic assay,
that's what I was saying, when you were asking me like the proportion of non-white, it's difficult to say. I got onto the interracial marriage debates because of this, because I was thinking about this. Yeah, it gets more difficult because what you really would like to estimate, and I could do this, like maybe I'll do this when I have this new data set, is like the share of like ascendants, the average, non-European ascendants, like among the French population. And I would give you, because the thing is that there is like quite a lot of mixing. Not, of course, you do also have like a lot of like increasing number of enclaves that are where you have very little mixing. And I think that's a huge problem. And it's just actually, there's another thing I want to say about this is that, again, I'm not saying that's the only factor. I don't even believe that's the only factor, but another thing people don't think about when they make those comparisons. Let's even assume that the simplistic claims to the effect that Americans are just much less racist and more tolerant than Europeans were true. Let's even assume that it's true for the sake of the argument. Then you should still ask yourself why it's true. And I think that plausibly, to the extent that this is true, and again, like we said before, it's much more complicated in reality, but to the extent that it's true, and as you said, it also varies a lot between European countries. But to the extent that it is true, you have to keep in mind that like non-white immigrants in Europe, in Western Europe, like create problems that they don't in the US. For instance, in the US, they don't commit more crime than than the native population. In fact, they commit less often, like for most countries of origin. In France, that's a very different picture. In France and in all of Western Europe. Like we're talking about, if you look at immigrants from North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, or the Middle East in Western Europe, we're talking about population that in those countries commit violent crime at several times the rate of the rest of the population. And obviously this is going to affect how people react to them. Again, I'm not saying that this is the only reason why there is like animosity toward them, etc. But it's just like foolish to think that this doesn't play a role. Because again, like for instance, again, this is anecdotal, but I would say that the average French person, if he sees like an Arab or a black person who is dressed like a French person, speaks like a French person, like they just don't care. Like they have no problem seeing that person as French. Now, if they see him dressed like in the typical fashion of like youth in the suburbs, French projects, in France they're in the suburbs, not in inner cities like in the US. We speak of like an accent. It's not actually an accent from their country of origin. Often those guys were born in France. It's an accent typical from those areas, it's difficult to describe it. Like it has a very there's something kind of like harsh about it, etc. Who have the typical demeanor of those people. Then they do have a very different attitude, and so all I'm saying, I'm not saying it's not as if there is no racism that is like that. That I'm not even saying that to the extent there is racism, it's entirely caused by the, pathologies of immigrant population in France. But I think it's foolish not to take that into account. It's a very immigration in France and immigration in the US are extremely different experiences. And Americans also, it's amazing, honestly, listening to Americans talk about immigration in Europe. It's very clear that they're projecting the American experience onto Western Europe. And it's really, really very different. They're very naive about it. They will, an argument I've heard often is that, oh, look, we also have we also have like uneducated immigrants. We have plenty of Mexicans. And, it's like those people think that all uneducated immigrants are the same, but they're not. I mean, even in the US, like just look at any data set on like virtually any characteristic, income, education, crime, whatever. And you look at different immigrant groups, sorted by countries of origin. Even if you control for age and education, you will always, there's no exception, always find like huge differences, like a huge range of variation on any variable of interest that you care to look at. So it's just absurd to make this assumption that, people have. I've written a piece about this recently, a few months ago. I call that America's special sauce theory, which is the theory that if the US is better at integrating immigrants, again, as I mentioned in that piece, this would deserve to be nuanced, but whatever, I'll accept it for the sake of the argument. I think there's definitely a lot of truth to this. People assume that it's because the US has some kind of special sauce that makes it better at integrating immigrants. And I'm not even saying that there isn't something to this too, but it ignores how completely different the kinds of immigrants that we get in Western Europe and that you get in the US are. And this is clearly what explains most of the differences. And people who think that it's some kind of magical special sauce that the US has are completely delusional. And their arguments are statistically extremely naive. It's the stuff I was talking about. Oh, we also have uneducated immigrants. Well, we also do. We have plenty of uneducated immigrants that we have no problem integrating. And another thing that that's another thing I think most Americans don't realize about France, is that we're actually a null country of immigration. We're basically the US of Europe. We've had immigration since the end of the 19th century, and we've been pretty good at integrating those people. Most of those people, like, we've had no problem with most of them. So, it's not like, the simple story of like, it's just like Europeans are racist and that's why it's not working. I mean, it's just, when you look at the
Well, I mean,
data, you look at the evidence, there's
well,
just not.
okay. So I mean, the issue, is I mean, you've talked about this, but there are Vietnamese immigrants to France. What's going on with them?
They do very well.
What's going on with them?
They do very well. They
So
do
why
extremely
is
well.
that?
In fact, arguably, they do even better than in the US. If you look at, that's the thing, that's another thing I mentioned in that piece on America's special sauce theory, is that if you look at immigrants that actually are comparable, it's really not clear that they're doing better in the US than they do in France. It depends on what metric you're looking at. Obviously, they're going to be richer in the US because everybody's richer in the US. But, they perform extremely well at school. If you look at I was talking about intermarriage, they intermarry with native French people, French people of European descent, at like incredible rates. We're talking about the children of Asian immigrants. It's like over 90%. The data are from a few years ago, but it's been stable for like, at the time I looked, it had been stable for like 15, 20 years. So I doubt it has changed. Those a lot of those people are like also uneducated, extremely poor when they arrived. Similar to the Jewish immigrants earlier in the 1920s, we also had a lot of Jewish immigration. And in France, most of them survived the Holocaust during World War II. Well, I mean, those people are just smart. They have lots of pro-social behavior. And they value school a lot. This is true for both the Jewish immigrants and the more recent Asian immigrants, East Asian immigrants. So they've been doing very well. If you look at school performance, so that's another thing. People think we don't have data on this. I frequently hear people tell me, "Oh, can you make this claim because France doesn't collect data on this?" But as we mentioned earlier, yes, they do. We do, and so we do have like various surveys. Studies conducted by the French statistical agencies in collaboration with the Ministry of Education. And so they do those standardized tests and they actually look at, so it's not based on race in the sense that's self-identified race, but it's based on the country and citizenship of birth of the parents of the kids. And so you do see that already, East Asian kids at school, they do extremely well. if you look at the early years, they tend to do a bit worse or about the same as the kids of the natives. But then if you look at a few years later, then they actually do better, which I think is mostly because of language. At first, many of them were not actually born in France, so they don't fully master, and their parents don't speak French at home, so at first they don't fully master the French language. As soon as they do, then they're actually better than the French students. That's another thing. It really depends. There are some groups that we just have a hard time integrating, and some groups that we do very well. And I don't think it's because I don't think it's because French society is great or whatever. I think it's mostly the merit is mostly the immigrants themselves. But similarly, I think that when they don't integrate, the fault is mostly, it's not as if we haven't tried, that's another thing, that we've actually spent like tons and tons of money trying to integrate North African immigrants in particular. And it just doesn't work. And, so people will say, oh, that's because of laïcité, for instance. Well, I mean, again, I just wish that people, before talking about this, would just look at the data.
Define what that is for the listeners who don't know.
So laïcité, strictly speaking, French people themselves say a lot of bullshit about this. Strictly speaking, laïcité it's secularism. It's the separation of the states from the churches, or the churches from the church in France, because it was the Catholic Church, from the state. And so it's the state neutrality in matters of religion. That's what it originally is. But now, so this is interesting, actually. Now it has morphed into this like very vague and like proteiform notion of that doesn't apply anymore to the state, which is what the legal original meaning is. It's something that it's neutrality of the state. It applies to the state, not to people. And now it has morphed into this idea that's really not clear. It's used very opportunistically, I think, where it applies to individuals, to citizens, or actually non-citizens for that matter. Individuals living in France, and the idea that they're not supposed to show to outwardly show their religious affiliation. So, they're not that, for instance, it's since 2004 in French public schools, it's forbidden for students to wear a headscarf. They can still go and, they can go to a private school if they really want to. So it's not as if it's like an absolute ban, but in public school. And this is justified by laïcité, which is a total distortion of the original meaning. And I was saying that this is interesting because my interpretation of this, and now it's put, people are using that concept, which again is a very vague, largely nonsensical concept in the way it's used now, to basically clamp down on, public expression of like mostly the Muslim religion. And my interpretation of this is that people, we have our own political correctness in France. And so people don't want to say, because even to themselves, I mean, I don't think those people are being, disingenuous, like consciously. I think they really have internalized that rhetoric. But even to themselves, they won't admit that simply they don't like people dressing up as foreigners in their streets. But because they don't think of themselves as because that's intolerant. So they don't think of themselves as intolerant people. They've come up with this extended and very vague notion of laïcité to say, okay, this is bad. We don't actually have a law against this, to be clear. It's perfectly legal in France to wear a headscarf in the streets. But some people will say, okay, now we need to ban this because of laïcité. Laïcité is about how you should not show your religion in public. That's not at all what originally was. But I think people do this because they won't admit, first of all, to themselves that they're just bothered by the fact that foreign-looking people, and when I say foreign-looking people, again, I'm not talking about the color of their skin, because if someone looks like Arab but is dressed up like a French person, almost all of those people will not give a shit. But they will be bothered if they wear like, Muslim-looking garments, basically. But they won't admit that even to themselves, and so they will say it's because of laïcité. They will just literally make up this principle, pretend that it's been a long-standing French principle, and use that to argue against that sort of things. But it's mostly because of this political correctness that they have internalized. I say that, personally, I'm against banning that stuff. I think I'm in favor of individual freedoms, and I think it would be unacceptable to, even in school, I don't think that we should ban the headscarf. It's just that if it were for me, there would be very few people who would want to to wear a headscarf in school or in the street, because that would have very different immigration laws. And so I would, I wouldn't like, basically my approach to immigration would be, I'm fine with like educated, immigrants from wherever, because statistically I know that they will do well. They will be economically productive. They will not commit crime. They will integrate, often they will intermarry. In 3 generations, you won't even know that they were there in the first place, etc., etc. They're just a good thing for France. And of course you have, you can't have like 2 million of them arriving each year, because even those people in such numbers would be socially disruptive. But, this is not a realistic thing anyway. So nobody's talking about doing that. So I have no problem with this. But when it comes to uneducated immigrants, then I think we should be looking at the data on how well different groups are doing. And we should not let people from groups of uneducated immigrants who have a track record of causing huge social problems come, and we should have no problem with the others come, again, like in reasonable numbers. So that would be my approach. But most people don't want, most people won't say that, because they think, I mean, this is changing, I think at this point, most people would say that. They just won't vote for the people who say they want to do that. I mean, to be honest, even if they did, I doubt that this would really change, because look, realistically, right now, it would be Le Pen. And honestly, I think Le Pen and the people in our party are too incompetent it's not that easy to change immigration. The only way you're ever going to do this is approaching the problem as a technocratic problem. And I don't think those guys can do this. They prefer to shout dumb slogans. I very much doubt that if she wins, I don't think she will, but next time. But anyway, she will win eventually, if not her successor.
Marianne.
Marion No is in a different party. I don't think she'll be our successor. But now there is like a younger guy who's now the head of the party, even though she's still the boss, the real boss.
All right, so again, let's give some context. Talk about the political parties in France, and why Le Pen is important.
So right now, it's really changed. Macron changed everything. It used to be that we were not quite a two-party system like in the US. You always had like several like political parties beside the big left-wing party, which was called the Socialist Party. I mean, it still is, but no, it's irrelevant. And the big right-wing party, which had a variety of names over the years, which is also irrelevant now. And then you had like a number of smaller parties that were not completely irrelevant, like they were needed to form governments, etc. But but mostly it was a mostly two-party system. It changed with Macron. Macron basically gathered the centrists in both the big left-wing party and the big right-wing party, and formed this big centrist party that now at least dominates the political life at the national level. It doesn't dominate locally at all. In fact, it performed very poorly locally. But at the national level, it has been dominating the last 2 cycles. And the formerly big left-wing country is now irrelevant. It took a bit longer, but so is the formerly large right-wing country. And so the other 2 big political forces, other than the centrist, Macron's centrist party, in France, are now the National Front, which now is called has changed its name a few years ago. It's called the National Rally. I mean, that would be a translation, which is a far right party. And we have a far left party, which is called La France Insoumise. I'm not even going to try and translate this, but those parties, like they scare too many people to have a shot, at least so far, of winning at the national level. Now, if you think about immigration, like the the vast majority of French people, and it's a similar story in the rest of Europe, Western Europe anyway, are extremely anti-immigration. So if you ask them question, but they're not ideologues, they're not very consistent, and it's a mistake. People have this model of electoral behavior, which I think is a very bad model, which is people vote so as to maximize the satisfaction of their ideological preferences. But people do not, in fact, vote like this. Because normal people are not ideologues. They barely have coherent ideological preferences. It's an exaggeration to say they have no ideological preferences. Sometimes people say that, but certainly they're not like weird people like us, who talk about politics on Twitter, etc. And so the way people vote mostly, I think, is that they identify certain social groups and they think, okay, how does a person who belongs to that social group should vote? And that's how they vote. And so, for instance, I often give this example because I think it's very telling. You will talk to a regular French grandmother and you talk to her about immigration. And, I'm just exaggerating for effect, but not that much. And it's like you're in front of Heinrich Himmler. She will say stuff about immigration and immigrants that Marine Le Pen would never say. But I don't mean never say just in public. I can tell you she'd never say that in private either. And so then you're like, okay, so I guess that means you're going to vote for Le Pen, right? And that same grandmother, who was just 5 seconds ago was like Heinrich Himmler talking about immigrants, is going to be genuinely horrified that you would make such a suggestion. Because no, of course, Marine Le Pen is in the National Rally is a fascist party. I'm not a fascist. I'm not going to vote for a fascist party. So they won't vote. And, they're really scared, of her, for that kind of reason. So old people who are in France, as in the US, the largest, voting bloc, that's where it's different from the US. The far right does very poorly among old people in France. I mean, actually, last time Trump also did more poorly with Biden, but whatever, like in the Anglo world, there tends to be a gradient with age where it leans right. And, they do lean right, but center right, the old people. And that's the main reason why Le Pen hasn't been able to win. And, the far left party has a similar problem, but even worse, because in their case, it's not just the old people who are scared of them, but a lot of like the, middle class, moderates, are also very scared of them. More, I think at this point, I mean, they're also scared of Le Pen, but I think at this point, they're probably even more scared of the far left. So that's kind of like the political picture in France. And I really doubt that even in 2027, which is the next French presidential election, I really doubt that Le Pen can win, or at least is going to win. I think there is one scenario at this point I can think of where she would, is that a big problem that's going to arrive for the centrists in 2027 is that Macron cannot run a third time because the French constitution, which was modified under Sarkozy, forbids that. So they will have to find a new candidate. And you can imagine a scenario in which Macron's party splits over this. I don't think that's the most likely. I think the most likely option is that Edouard Philippe, who's the former prime minister of Macron, will be successor. He will run for the centrist party and he will win. But if the party split, if the centrist party split, then I think there's a very good chance that she will pass, that she will win. But I think it's very unlikely it will split, so probably she won't. Just the name Le Pen is really like a scarecrow for most people, especially old people in France. But it's changing, like recently, you never know, I mean, again, I think it's very unlikely, but events, current events can also have an effect. Like recently, there was just like a group of some immigrants, some are immigrants, some are children of immigrants, North African, who attacked a village dance in the middle of nowhere in France, and like stabbed several people, killed a kid, and they were like, we are here to stab. According to several testimonies of the people who were at the dance, we're here to stab white people. And so you have videos where you see like people screaming. It's like almost like a terrorist attack. So this was really shocking to a lot of people. And it's kind of like, if something like this happened in between the two rounds of the presidential election, then I wouldn't bet that Le Pen would not be elected. But this is down to chance. It's just random. Like there's no particular reason to expect that it's not as if this kind of stuff happened. I mean, you do have shocking things like this happening on a regular basis in France. But still, we're only talking about 2 weeks, the period between the two rounds of the presidential election. I feel like the probability that it's not impossible that something like this will happen during those 2 weeks, but it's probably not what's going to happen, and yeah, so that's
Well,
kind of
okay,
like, where
so
we're
that's
at,
probably not going to happen. All right, so immigration policy is not going to get changed. I mean, 10% foreign born. I mean, one thing I do have to say is that intermarriage rates of I looked once like 10, 15 years ago of North African women in France is it was like 30% versus like 5% for Pakistani women in the UK. The UK has a different problem with like a much more insular community. It looks like the French Muslims by origin are way less insular, but you've had massive problems with them in terms of terrorism, targeting Jews and Jewish institutions and whatnot, right?
Yeah, so yes, that's I think that's right. It's definitely less insular in France. Again, it's if you look, putting the woman aside, because yeah, I mean, Pakistani women are, they have a very low labor force participation, rate. But that's also true of North African women in France, but not as true. But and but yeah, it's it on to say things quickly. Yes, I think that's about right. We do, I have to say, it's not as if like all North Africans in France, obviously, we're not integrating. I mean, we also have, that's another thing, we've had a lot of success integrating like North Africans who were not, especially those who are educated, mostly don't cause big problems, and do pretty well. There are, that's another thing. I also don't want to deny that there are victims of discrimination. There definitely are. If you're looking for an apartment, for instance, and you have an Arabic name in France, you will 100% have a harder time finding one than if you have a French sounding name. So that's true. But again, you cannot think about this without taking into account the fact that, people engage in statistical discrimination that, may overshoot, but is based on a reality. So, we have like, we have different kinds of problem. We have different kinds of problem like the UK. There's no, each system has its advantages, its downsides. France, it's less insular. I do think it's getting worse, because we're having like areas where, in particular, kids, the children of immigrants. Like I did some charts, looking at the data on this. But like if you look at the proportion of children of immigrants who live in areas, in neighborhoods where more than half of the population are also children of immigrants. More half of the population under 18, I mean, are also children of immigrants. It has increased rapidly in the past 30 years, and is going to keep increasing. And so you increasingly have those areas. I don't have the specific numbers. I think at this point it's in the high 30% of them who live in areas where there are more than 50% of the population. And it used to be like, I'd have to check. I don't have the numbers, but it used to be much lower in 1990. So you have like, if you look at an area like the Seine-Saint-Denis, which is a department, an administrative division near Paris, in the northeast of Paris. At this point, you have like in a lot of those areas where like more than a lot of the cities, towns in that department, where like over 70% of the kids are themselves children of immigrants, of non-European immigrants. I was talking earlier, the figure I gave was also for non-European immigrants. This, right now, if you look at the other big metropolitan areas in France, basically they're where Seine-Saint-Denis was in 1990. So if we go at the same pace in 30 years, in every large metropolitan area in France, there will be a Seine-Saint-Denis. And that's really scary. That's like, because again, it's like the situation over there is really bad. It's like, in that case, it's actually really insular. It's high crime. If you're Jewish or gay, for instance, that is definitely not a place where, honestly, if you're white too, but it's even worse, of course, if you're gay or Jewish, you do not want to live there, etc., etc. And so we are kind of like, this is a very predictable outcome of our current policies. But I think that's where we're headed, because I don't see, as I was saying, I don't see those policy change. I think that even though the population, is very anti-immigration, they still vote for centrist parties. Will do. It's not as if they will do nothing, because they still have to take that into account. But mostly what they'll do will be symbolic and may actually increase immigration. And even if they eventually vote for Le Pen, I don't believe that those guys in our party have what it takes in terms of like competence and how they approach the problem to actually affect real change that would avoid this outcome. So I think that's where we're headed. And I think it's predictable. I think it's also predictably really bad. And we're seeing increasingly the consequences already today. But, that's, doesn't change the fact that I think that's where we're headed. And again, I think Americans really need to understand. I'm literally on my knees begging them to look at the data before just jumping at like really simplistic explanations on this, and
Well,
to
okay.
understand that, it's a very different experience than what they have in the US.
Well, so in the more broadly European context, there's this whole like gang issue in Sweden and Sweden's like 20% foreign born. It's like ridiculously high. So obviously each European country has its own policy. Some of them don't take too many immigrants at all. Like I think, Poland or Hungary or something. Or at least like extra European immigrants, right? But I guess the
You'd be
question,
surprised. Poland actually takes a lot. People don't know that, but
where do they come from?
So they take a lot of non-European immigrants, but a lot of them are from India, for instance. They have some Southeast
So it's like high
Asians. They
tech.
do have some like Middle Eastern too. So it's they take, like the Polish far right. They're really pissed off at the former government. No, I mean the PiS, the loud right-wing populist party. Because they think they're basically betraying the voters by having like very high immigration while pretending to be anti-immigration. They will like publicly make fun of France because of our problems and stuff. But the Polish far right say, yeah, I mean actually you're doing the same thing, even though. So yeah, I mean but whatever. It's Denmark, I think, is an example of a country, and interesting, it was done largely by the left that has clamped down on immigration. Because they feel it threatens their the welfare state. Because that's another thing, people have this argument that we need immigration to save our pension system. That's a very common talking point in France and in most of Western Europe. But talking about France, for instance, if you look at the net fiscal contribution of North African and Sub-Saharan African immigrants, it's actually negative. It's been consistently negative. So in fact, they will make the pension system problem worse. That's not to say that they don't play a useful economic role, at least some of them, those who work. But labor force participation is extremely low. Unemployment is very high. So, their employment rate overall is extremely low. So they won't have the kind of like, they're not the kind of like economic panacea that a lot of people imagine. It's just, again, it's people. I ask people, before you talk about, just look at the data. It's just not true. So it won't, the economic case for this immigration, specifically, I'm talking specifically in France, at least, but this is very similar in the rest of Western Europe. At least everywhere I've looked at the data, like the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden. If you look at the uneducated immigrants from North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, the economic case for bringing them is it's just very bad. It's not, I'm not one of those people who think there are a lot of anti-immigration people who think that they're also an economic disaster. That's not true. Mostly the economic effects of immigration are just not that large, but it works both ways. It cuts both ways. They're not not that large, in one direction, also not that large in the other direction. So there isn't really an economic case for bringing those people, and they cause a lot of social disruption. We do have a problem of aging, but if we want to address this, then the rational thing to do, and with immigration, it would be even better if we could just address it by increasing fertility. But as you know, this is very difficult, and nobody really knows how to do it. It's not even clear that it can be done. But if we want to do it with
Although
immigration,
France's TFR is higher than the U.S. Our
it
fertility
is
crashed
now.
after 2008.
Yeah, it is now. Historically, we've been doing better than the rest of Europe, and it used to be that the US was doing about as well as us, but recently you've crashed. But the thing is that we're also crashing now. So I fear that this French exception will soon no longer be an exception. I think we're just lagging a bit behind you, but our TFR is also crashing. And it wasn't great to begin with, and people were bragging about something that was still below replacement. It's just that in the kingdom of blind people, the one height is king. So
our population, without immigration, our population would only shrink 10% per decade. As opposed to 15 or 20.
So if we want to use immigration to address this problem, we have better source. I mean, there are a lot of East Asians. There are a lot of lots of untapped potential, like Indians or whatever. We could do. Again, it's not that easy. When you don't have when there isn't an existing community in your country, it's not that easy to bring new people. But it can be done. I mean, the income gap is so huge that if we really wanted to, and we could do this, I don't, I don't think we should have huge levels of immigration, but certainly if we could do even keeping the levels similar, if we could substitute, even increasing them somewhat, if we could substitute the sources, the type of immigration, it would be much better. And there you would have an economic case. You bring Vietnamese, they will work, they will help with the pension problem. They will actually do a lot of stuff that the French people won't do. At least they won't do at the same price. So, we won't have to allocate scarce capital to automatize tasks that could be performed for cheap by immigrants, capital that could be used more productively in other places. So, there is an economic case for bringing in some immigrants. But the idea that there is an economic case for bringing tons of uneducated North Africans in France is just ridiculous. I mean, it's something that really bothers me when people say that, because I'm just look, you've clearly never thought or look at the evidence about this stuff when you say this thing. It's just I can hear someone who will make the humanitarian argument in favor of immigration, because I don't deny that, uneducated North Africans, when they come to France, it does increase their standard of living a lot. And I don't even deny that this is a good thing, other things being equal. But other things are not equal. And, I don't think that France has a duty to turn itself into a much worse place to increase the well-being of people who, at the end of the day, are only, it's only going to make a tiny dent into global poverty. So I'm sorry, but I don't think that France should turn itself into a really bad place, which really is what's going to happen. Again, people say no, but look, I mean, I don't believe in magic. I see no reason why this is not going to happen. Integration is actually getting harder when you have larger community for all sorts of reasons. I mean, to give just an example, I think one of the best ways and most effective ways in practice in which immigrants and their descendants have been integrated into a society in practice has been intermarriage. That's why I've been talking a lot about this. And so, but it's intermarriage rates, they are sensitive to the size of the community. When you have everybody has a preference for endogamy to some extent. It varies between the groups, the extent to which this is true, but it's true for every group. So when you have a large
at a group level, there are individuals.
Yeah,
we won't get into that.
Yeah, we won't get into this, but so on average, people have a preference for endogamy, and so if the larger the community, the less other things being equal, intermarriage, exogamy and intermarriage will be. And this is not just, so you have a good like theoretical reason to expect this, but it's actually borne out by the data. We have like some of the data that has been collected in France. I've looked at this myself, so I know that, there is a clear association between, the share of the population where people live that is from their origin and exogamy. And so, but this is like not surprising at all. So that's just one example, and there are many others, about, illustrating the fact that I was talking about, that, integration gets harder because, you think about France, like 50 years ago, you were an Arab, a North African in France. You were just like a tiny minority in a sea of French people. Like the pressure to integrate was much higher. The pressure decreases when your community gets larger. So the idea that we're going to somehow solve this problem that we've been unable to solve for the past 50 years, despite spending like inordinate amount of money trying to solve it. To me, it's just magical thinking. I mean, I'm not, if you tell me, is it impossible? Of course it's not impossible. Weird things happen, but it's irrational to count on the weird thing happening. And this is what I'm saying here. It's just like a completely commonsensical argument. But people will just deny this. It's pure ideology. It's pure. It's become a religion. People just they don't have an answer to this argument, other than, just magical thinking. Oh yeah, we're going to try this. And usually this is something that has already been tried like dozens of times. They will talk about stuff that just, the reason is because we have, it's because we concentrate them in the same place, in shitty projects or stuff like that, for instance. So, first of all, and there's too much segregation. First of all, given how many of them there already is, and how many of them there will be if we keep immigration continues at the current pace, I want people to explain to me. I've actually done the math, so I know that if you want to, even at the current level, if you wanted to homogenize the under 18 population of non-European children of non-European immigrants, you would have to move from their neighborhood. I think it's 38%, if I remember correctly, 38% of the population. I want those people to explain to me how they're going to do this. How are they going to move 30? And, this is like, if we stopped immigration right now, but of course we aren't going to do that. So like, it's just like not a realistic thing. But then again, suppose we do this. This whole idea is premised on the assumption that neighborhood are what explains, the high crime rates of these populations. And that, those people have various kinds of like antisocial behavior because they live in shitty neighborhoods. But the causality runs in the other direction. It's because they have all sorts of antisocial behavior that their neighbors are shitty. You put Vietnamese in those neighborhoods and they will be great. So, and I don't say that. This is not like a gratuitous assumption that I'm making. There is a lot of literature on that. The evidence for neighborhood effects is very weak. Like you can look at different ways. You look at the literature that used random lotteries where people have been moved to different neighborhoods, and you look at their outcomes when they go there. Or, you can look at, there was a Finnish study recently where they have they have great data over there because they have population registry of like pretty much everything in them. And so they have a longitudinal, this study was using a longitudinal data set, meaning they follow people over time. And you can see what happens when they change neighborhood, when they go from a shitty neighborhood to a non-shitty neighborhood, or when other people go from a non-shitty neighborhood to a shitty neighborhood. And you look at whether this affects their crime rates. And it just mostly doesn't. And there is so much evidence. So that's just an example of people like proposing a solution that is premised on a demonstrably false assumption. And even if it weren't premised on a demonstrably false assumption, we'd have no practical way of acting on this idea without cutting immigration in the first place. Because again, even if we cut immigration in the first place, we'd still have to move like hundreds of thousands of people. How are you going to do this? I mean, we're not like communist China. You can't just like order people around, and also, you need to build housing in different, like how are you going to do that? So it's just like what I'm saying here is that I say those things. like, I don't think I'm an extremist. There's nothing like weird or like irrational about what I'm saying. It's the opposite. I'm making like a very rational argument here. And I've never heard anyone have a rational response. Usually is some variation of you're just racist. Okay, maybe I'm racist, but like doesn't mean I'm wrong. If you want to call this racist, I don't really care. Or just like I said, just magical thinking. Oh, somehow we'll figure it out. Why? I don't know.
Well, so you're talking a lot about, so I want to close out with the last topic. You're talking about the immigration of the present. Obviously, a lot of it is from North Africa. It's historically been from North Africa. But if you look at the fertility rates in MENA, Middle East, North Africa, they're crashing. There's one part of the world where the fertility rates are dropping, but they're not crashing. They're still going to produce surplus humans. As Sub-Saharan Africa, you guys already have a lot of, you in France, because of Francophone, obviously Africa, already have a lot of connections. I guess a question that I have, and, we should, be a little more concise because, we've gone a while, but,
Yeah.
Okay, Africa's going to have a huge population. Do Europeans have the will to actually not allow these people to migrate? Because the economic difference is huge, their incentives are strong, and there's a lot of them, like billions of them, right? And they're not, it's not like China. If Chinese wanted to go to Europe, okay, that's a problem. There's a lot of Chinese people, but it's on the other side of the Sahara. And a lot of these Arab countries, Morocco and Libya and Algeria are there. They're not going to keep them. They would rather send them along, right? So what is the future of that, I wonder?
I mean, the answer to your question, will we have the will to prevent this, is, as you can probably guess based on what I said before, almost certainly no. Like the immigration flows are essentially a function of your immigration policies on the one hand, and immigration pressure on the other hand, which depends a lot on demography in the potential source countries. And so what you're leading to is the fact that, population in sub-Saharan Africa is going to increase very rapidly before it stabilizes. And so, it's basically going to double in the next 30 years or something. And so this will increase immigration pressure a lot to Europe, which means that other things being, keeping immigration policies equal, inflows are expected to increase. Now, I think that because, immigration is becoming more of a political problem, I think that to some extent there will be more restriction. So immigration policies will become more restrictive. But because I don't think this will compensate, or more than compensate for the increase in immigration pressure due to demography in sub-Saharan Africa. So, no, we're probably looking at higher. It's already, immigration, we've had for a while, in France, immigration from sub-Saharan Africa, but it has increased a lot since the 2000s. And this is going to become more and more true. Eventually, not the North African or the larger immigrant communities in France, but in 30 years, it will be sub-Saharan Africa, sub-Saharan Africans. So, and they also, in some respects, so for instance, if you look at intermarriage, it is higher. I think this is another thing that may surprise Americans. Sub-Saharan African immigrants in France intermarry at significantly higher rates than North Africans, even though in the US, North Africans would be regarded as white, at least administratively, but not the Sub-Saharan Africans. And I think this is mostly because of religion, because although there are lots of Sub-Saharan Africans who are Muslims, a lot of them are Christians. And if you look at the data, religion is a huge barrier to intermarriage. People care a lot about this. And so a lot of Black African immigrants in France marry outside of their group with French people of European descent, much more than North African. So in that respect, this is good because like I said before, intermarriage is a powerful factor of integration. But nevertheless, they still do very poorly across several important metrics. They do poorly at school. It depends on where from sub-Saharan Africa they're from. So we have mostly people from the Gulf of Guinea region and from the the Sahel region in France, and the ones from the Sahel do very poorly across every possible metric, be it crime, school performance. They do really very badly. So this is bad news. People, Sub-Saharan African immigrants from the Gulf of Guinea region, they also do poorly, but not as poorly as the ones from the Sahel, which I think is largely a result of like different family structure, religion, etc. So, but on the whole, they don't do well, and there's no reason to think that this will improve. I mean, there's some reason because education is going to increase, but I don't think it's realistic to expect that this will have a massive effect. And so I mean, it's you're right that this is the future of immigration to Western Europe, and I'd much prefer that we made the immigration policy more restrictive to prevent those flows from increasing too much. But to answer your question, I don't think this is going to happen. So if we're not going to do this, I don't know. I mean, we have to find some ways to deal with it intelligently if we're not going to stop it. And it's not clear how to do that. It's also not clear that any of the people who do not want to make immigration policy more restrictive are really thinking about how to do this. So I can't say that I'm really optimistic.
Well, on that cheery note, you dropping truth bombs left and right. I mean, I know a lot of this in terms of like we talked about it in the detail, but in the details, it's always interesting to explicate. And here in the United States, we've been focusing on Europe's demographics since obviously 9/11 and your Muslim population. There were some exaggerated predictions about like this. Well, at this time, about how you were going to have Muslim majorities and Emirates and all these things. And I mean, if you read Mark Stein's book, I forget what it was titled, but from the 2000s, he was predicting by early 2020 that a lot of European nations would be Muslim, which was like...
To be clear, this is still the case. Anti-immigration people in Europe, like they don't have very realistic expectation, but they don't realize how difficult, how much inertia big countries like France have demographically, and so they have very unrealistic expectations about the speed of the change. So yeah, this is still true. People still haven't learned.
Yeah.
So this is true. It doesn't mean what I'm saying doesn't rest on any of those unrealistic expectations. But
yeah. No, I mean, yeah. So, obviously, we'll see. We'll see what happens in the next 10, 20 years. You're still living in France. You're still going to be there. You're still fighting whatever fight you're going to have to fight. I mean, it might be a literal fight from what you're talking about, but that's your country. You're not coming here. And so it was great talking to you. People can find you mostly on X. And you're writing your stuff for. I mean, you publish in Quillette and all sorts of other places, but your affiliation, you're a fellow at CSPI, right? So it's like that's how people can find you.
I write on CSPI. I also have a Substack, and like you said, I write to a number of places. So
yeah, you're all over the place.
The stuff.
No, then they will find you. They will find you.
Yeah, if they go on Twitter, they'll find the different things.
Yeah. All right. It was great having you on, and I will talk to you soon. I'll probably see you in DC sometime soon again.
Yeah, I hope so. That was great. Thanks for having me.
This podcast for kids. This